What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
So, Nick, we speculated the other day on what Khamzat Chimaev was going to do next, and we thought that maybe it would be Israel Adesanya, but there were some other options at play as well, and we ended up on Belal Muhammad. We think that's probably who he's going to end up fighting in his next fight. However, that still leaves UFC 293 in Sydney as TBD officially on the UFC's website. Now, all signs are pointing to Israel Adesanya headlining that event. It's in his neck of the woods. He's their biggest star right now. He sells out stadiums, and I think he's going to be one half of the main event. And then when you look at Robert Whittaker taking on Du Plessis, 185 is full. We got Marvin Vettori, Jared Cannonier this weekend. So I'm racking my brain as to who Israel's going to fight at UFC 293. And I have come to the conclusion that the UFC is going to let him go for champ status again, and they're going to bring in Jamahal Hill. It's what makes sense to me. It seems like a winnable fight for Adesanya. Obviously, they would want him to have a big night in Sydney, Australia. So I'm going to go ahead and break some news and say that I believe that Israel Adesanya is going to contend for champ against Jamahal Hill at UFC 293. What do you think about my theory?
I think if this happens, you need to be deemed the official breaker of unofficial news, because this is a great take, and I actually did the same sort of looking through the top five of the 185 division and the 205 division, and you start to wonder, like, okay, is somebody going to come out of thin air and compete for the belt? And, you know, if these guys are all fighting and Izzy's already beat these other guys, and we don't really know who he's going to fight next, but Izzy does want to be active in the remainder of his career, because we don't really know how much longer he's going to fight. But as the champion, he wants to defend that belt as frequently as possible. And when you've got something like another historic night in Australia taking place, you've got to have either him or Volkanovski on it or something insane. But
right.
For the most part, Volkanovski is going to have his hands full against Yair Rodriguez, and he's likely not going to be able to compete when 293 rolls around. So that leaves you basically with Izzy Adesanya to main event that slot. And like we said just a second ago, 185 doesn't really have any dance partners for him. And I think that Khamzat Chimaev could be the guy to jump right into a title fight at 185. But I also don't really know if they want to do that with Izzy Adesanya right as he's going back to Australia to try to defend his belt once again for the first time on this new run. So I always go back to Izzy's saying, you got to dare to be great in this sport. And he always wants to try to do the things that most people could never dream of doing. And if he could go back up to 205 and give it another crack for a champ status, I think that would be awesome. It would really fit the Izzy story. You know, he gets knocked down and he gets back up again, kind of like that famous song back in the day.
Chumbawamba.
Chumbawamba, great tune.
Nice reference.
Yeah. And off the top of my head, they might even be from Australia with a name like Chumbawamba. But Izzy, you know, he didn't get his hand raised when he went up to 205 the first time. He went back down, handled some business at 185, and then went through a bunch of adversity with Pereira. Now I think it'd be the perfect opportunity for him to come back up. Glover's been retired. Jan Blachowicz has a dance partner, and he's going to be fighting Pereira. And all the other guys at the top five are pretty much, you know, either in business with somebody else or on the sidelines like Yuri Prochazka. So I think Jamahal Hill needs to fight soon, because he hasn't been in there since Glover Teixeira's retirement when they were in Brazil and he took the belt. I think that's a perfect opportunity for Izzy.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty much locked up at 185 and 205. As you said, Alex and Jan Blachowicz, great fight, but they're probably both going to be nursing some injuries after that fight, and they're going to need some time off. You have 185, which is Vettori and Cannonier happening this weekend. You got Du Plessis and Whittaker fighting to probably shake out who's going to be that number one contender. Paulo Costa's locked up with an up-and-comer. So it's something where you don't really see a whole lot of options. And unless the UFC is going to thrust Khamzat right in there in Sydney to take on Adesanya as the 185 champion, which I just can't see them doing. I think the UFC, as much as Dana is saying that I don't want Khamzat to contend at 170, his next fight's going to be at 185, I'm not super bullish on that. I'm not really buying it. Honestly, I believe they'd like to see him make a run and get the belt at 170, and then he could be one that could contend for a champ status thereafter. So I'm not over the fact that Khamzat Chimaev is probably going to still be contending and even likely have his next fight at welterweight, and I don't think they're going to thrust him in there and do that to Izzy. not on his home turf, but close enough. And so I think for that reason, and Jamahal Hill plays ball, man. He has one of the best Instagrams in the game. He's a lot of fun. He's fun to watch. He's explosive. Yes, there's leaps and bounds difference as far as technical proficiency goes between him and Adesanya, but make no mistake about it, Jamahal Hill can put you to sleep if you zig when you're supposed to zag.
Absolutely. And this might be a hot take, but I think the UFC sees Khamzat Chimaev as a very rare commodity and the first fighter they could ever see become champ. Triple champ status, and he'd have to do it 170, 185, and 205. And as the divisions sit right now, I think Hamza Chimaev matches up really well against every single one of those champions and would likely be the favorite in all three of those fights if he were to go in there with Leon Edwards, if he were to go in there with Izzy Adesanya, and if he were to go in there with Jamahal Hill. I think the odds makers would have him as the favorite for all three. And if the UFC is able to get that done and have Hamza Chimaev become the triple champion, you're talking about history in the making that could possibly never get touched again. And I think Khamzat Chimaev's the guy to do that.
That's a great point, and I do think the odds makers would probably have him as the favorite against all three of those, as you said. Now, all three of them are extremely tough fights. Rocky Edwards, Israel Adesanya, Jamahal Hill. I mean, any man on planet Earth that can defeat all three of those guys is a true BMF. And so that's no walk in the park. Make no mistake about that. However, it is doable for Khamzat Chimaev, but the window on that being doable is closing quickly. And why I say that is because Khamzat's still in his mid-20s. As he reaches 30 and beyond, he's just simply going to be too big for welterweight, which is why I'm still bullish on him fighting at 170 in his next couple of fights, because if he's going to make a run there, it needs to be sooner rather than later. And then as he fills his frame out, then you go up to middleweight and then you go up to light heavyweight as your career progresses. And that all brings me back to my point, which is I don't believe that he's going to be fighting Israel Adesanya at UFC 293. And I think the only person, we used to play Clue back in the day, and sometimes to find out who did the murder, at first you had to find out who didn't do it. And so I think we know who's not going to be fighting for the belt, and all that really leaves is Jamahal Hill. He's Colonel Mustard in the conservatory with the candlestick. Izzy Adesanya is fighting Jamahal Hill at UFC 293.
You heard it here first.